This morning's opening session is titled Envisioning a New Paradigm. And it's interesting that it's on the morning of day 2. We did that purposefully. We really thought, if we start with day 1, opening session, Envisioning a New Paradigm, we wouldn't have the benefit of establishing a little bit of guidance, some guardrails around the ideas and the possibilities of what RISE, the network, and the program can be, and how it can serve the community of universities that you all represent and many, many others to advance, accelerate, connect, interconnect, a mechanism and mechanisms for collaboration where scholarship can be shared, deployable actions that universities can play at the local and state and regional level can be shared across the university community. If that is what we're looking to design together, and I say together with all of you, we wanted to start day 2 with discussions around the new paradigm and help you all understand that by attending this conference and spending time with us, I'm not sure if you know this, so let me be very clear. You're all part of RISE now. This is as much your platform as it is ours, as much your initiative as it is ours. We here at NCSE are here to serve you in the design and execution of that, but we need your guidance and your direction in how to get there and what it looks like and what's possible. So with that to set our stage, we're going to spend some time together this morning talking much more concretely and specifically with colleagues here on stage about what different paradigms look like. Specific examples around the possibilities, the opportunities, the risks of not taking full advantage of science and evidence to inform decision making. Looking across sectors and having the benefit of different sector perspectives, both at all levels of government, beginning at the federal level, but also across community sectors, to ensure that as we knit this scarf, or we put this quilt together, that we are taking into account the importance of inclusion, the importance of diversity, and making sure that when we think about community, we all understand what we mean by that. And we're not making assumptions that we understand, that we share an understanding of community together. I'm going to briefly introduce to all of you our speakers this morning, and then invite each of you to give a little more content and detail about the current role that you play, and then maybe share a few minutes, each of you, from your perspectives, what this new paradigm might look like. We know that extreme weather events are part of our new normal. And many of you on stage have firsthand experienced those extreme weather events and disasters. And given that, this new paradigm that we're designing together, based on our new reality, it will be fantastic to hear your perspectives on that. So briefly, beginning from the very, very furthest of my, stage right? I don't know how to do that. Anyway, at the very furthest end of the stage, first I would like to, and I'm just going to run through all of our speakers and then pass it back to you, Vilda. Vilda, Vera, Mayuga, who is the Deputy Secretary for Economic Opportunity for the state of New York. Next to Vilda, we have Dan Cotter, who's the Principal Director from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Office of Science and Technology. And next to Dan, we have Jorge Iván Vélez-Arocho, who is the President of the Pontifical Catholic University of Puerto Rico, and I would be remiss if I did not mention that you were actually appointed by the Pope, and it is quite a privilege to have you here with us. And then next to Jorge, we have Faith Hall, who is co-founder from the Dominion Advisory Group, and you'll understand more detail from her background. I think we have a number of folks here on stage who came directly to this conference from the Caribbean. So if you see them, offer them a coat later or a hug. And then finally, next to Faith, we have Pete Lopez, who is the Regional Administrator from Region 2 with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So as you can see, we have a diversity of perspectives and experience, expertise, and knowledge that we will engage now. Vilda?
Thank you, everybody, for coming on the second day. I think it's very exciting. Thank you, Michelle, for having us. I'm actually una boricua de Puerto Nuevo en Río Piedras. Estoy en la UP Derecho, and then I move over here. So it's a great pleasure. I have to say, our Secretary of State, who's also a boricua, she could not make it because she had other conferences. And so she asked me if I could come on her behalf, and anything that has to do with Puerto Rico, then I'm like, oh yes, me. So I'm really excited to be here and share my perspective. In my current role as Deputy Secretary of State at the New York Department of State, I oversee 4 units, and none of them have anything to do with science, resiliency, or anything like that. But I'm hoping that I can share some experiences we've had in other areas that I believe are using the approach that I've heard discussed since yesterday, and that I think is our goal here of having a better collaboration to see better results more effectively and more efficiently. One of the offices that I oversee is the Division of Consumer Protection, and that has a lot to do with messaging to make sure that every resident of the state of New York is well informed for anything that may harm them economically. Another division that I oversee is the Division of Community Services, which is the unit within the state of New York that administers all of the federal funds that relate to anti-poverty programs. We have 47 partners across the state in each of the counties, almost each of the counties. Some of the organizations provide the services to more than one county. And we also have an additional, probably about a dozen partners with whom we partner to put into play innovative programs. What we call innovative programs, both in they're innovative. Probably someone else has already done them somewhere else and you don't know about them, which I think is part of the discussion that we're having during this conference. And another one of the units is the Address Confidentiality Program. It's a fascinating program. It's actually in, I want to say, almost 30 states or so, which provides a substitute address for victims of domestic violence, and that was until November 1st when the law became effective to expand that benefit to victims of stalking, sexual abuse, and human trafficking. And then the last unit is the Office for New Americans. We're very proud in the state of New York that we created the first statutorily mandated office for New Americans. We are quite a diverse state. We're obviously a very diverse nation, but in New York State, you know, when I moved here from Puerto Rico, my dad actually made fun of me because I was working with an agricultural program within the Department of Labor, and he asked me, where are the farms in New York? Because, you know, we in Puerto Rico, right, we say New York and we just think New York City, and we forget how huge the rest of the state is, and actually how large agriculture is of an industry in our state. But all that to say that through all of those units, we have been able to put into place a number of programs that we try to do it from the bottom up, particularly with the Office for New Americans. Every time I go into a room with other, you know, fellow government officials, I try to tell them, who are you to tell a community what is best for them? We think we have all these grand ideas, and we know best because of our positions of, you know, power in decision making and being at the table where those decisions are being made. But we forget that the best decision we can make is to ask the community. And through the Office for New Americans, what we decided was that we were not going to be engaged in providing direct services ourselves as a state. There are numerous organizations already in existence that provide these services that are embedded in the community, that know the communities, and we just need to give them money to be able to get deeper into their work, to really help them and to then come back to us and share some best practices that we can then share ourselves with others, in other programs, with other states. We have also we're fortunate that we have in our team our Director of Policy and Research, Dr. Laura Gonzalez Murphy. She is an academic, but she is in our team, and she brings also that perspective at the same time, and she helps us with that connection with universities where sometimes we go well and then we forget and we go back and do everything the same. And then we forget, we don't know if we were successful. And we had to go back and be like, how are we tracking? How do we measure success? And who's doing that? Who knows how to do that? And I think that's when universities become really helpful, because you'll know how to deal with numbers and what questions to ask and what data to gather and how to look at it to then inform what are the next steps. And that is something very fortunate for us, that we have that member of our team that, even though she is housed in our Office for New Americans, she is working right now, for example, with our Division of Community Services to find out what is it that we're accomplishing with these programs. Are we really helping people out of poverty? And that's, it's a constant dialogue, it's a constant conversation, and I think the biggest challenge is coming to the table with no preconceived notion. It's nearly impossible, but just reminding yourself, it's sort of like, to me, sort of like an implicit bias is there. You're always gonna have a bias, but just being aware that it's there so that you check yourself, and you can then allow for that input to come from people to tell you, you're wrong, and let me tell you why. But if you really want to help me, this is how you can do it. And then you really start thinking about it. New York City is huge. We have a very large government, also a lot of agencies with a lot of different expertise. And we're constantly trying to create working groups and then making those connections that maybe, I didn't know that another colleague of mine existed and was able to bring a certain expertise. So that's sort of like to give you an idea of what I do that is not necessarily related to disaster relief or preparing for it, but it is something, the approach that I believe has been discussed here, we are implementing in other areas. Looking forward to a discussion.
Morning.
That was for
I
me,
get
Dana,
applause
for
just
you.
to say good morning.
That was for me.
I like this
That was for
crowd.
me. Puerto Ricans, remember. Sorry.
Buenos dias. Having exhausted my Spanish. So my first experience with a catastrophic disaster was with Hurricane Frederick back in 1979 in Mobile, Alabama. Since then, working for FEMA, DHS, and in the private sector, I've had a chance to be to every state in the U.S., usually when something really bad had just happened. And one of my observations over the last 40 years or so is that these events really bring out the best in people. It's amazing the sharing you see, the contributions you see, the outpouring of help and support within communities. People have lost everything, helping other people. It's just amazing. What's wonderful about being here is rise. So this community has decided to take that loss, that hardship, that tragedy, and do something about it. And I think that's something you really should be applauded for. And from a Department of Homeland Security perspective, it's something we're very proud to be part of. A lot of these efforts, there's a lot of goodwill, but things start to recover, people go back to their jobs, they kind of fall apart. But it's really good to see this community in the way it's built, and it's something we're very happy to be part of. Let me just share kind of maybe 3 areas of thinking that are kind of informed by my past experience and the things I've heard here today. First, the role universities have to play their students in volunteering to support disasters. I think there's a couple parts of that to really think through that have been subject to some discussion. So the first piece is you really can't help anybody else unless you yourself are safe. So making sure you understand the threats and hazards to your university and your immediate community. So when an event happens, you are prepared to support others. Sometimes there's been some conversation I've heard about mutual aid agreement? You know, do you have agreements with the universities support each other? You know, I think that's a fantastic idea. Another, I think, concept with volunteerism, just keep in mind help is defined by the recipient. So you see a lot of good work being done. Sometimes volunteers show up and then you've got to take care of them. You know, their ideas are things that maybe, you know, aren't needed right then or maybe ever. And sometimes that can be a burden to the response community. So it's really important, I think, as you think through, as you would want to volunteer the things you do, that you do outreach. You're trying to understand what the requirements would be. Second piece, something that hasn't been talked about a bit here, but gets to some of the passion I have. Data and information sharing during disaster. It's absolutely critical, particularly in this age of technology. You know, it's really a lifeblood of making informed decisions. If you go back and you were to read the after-action report from Pearl Harbor, from 9/11, from Katrina, any number of events, the findings almost always say information was available to make better decisions, but it wasn't shared or was misunderstood. And that's something that we need to continuously work on. NIST, if you're not familiar with this space, has a special publication 1240 that talks about data sharing in disasters, standards, interoperability. Be tool agnostic, please. And one of the things I think about, disasters generate just massive amounts of data. Who's going to curate that? During Hurricane Katrina, when I was down there, you know, LSU did a phenomenal job of supporting that. But I think that also is a prime role for universities to think about. Kind of the last area I want to touch on, science. And this is what we really need from our university research community. We need your science. We need independent research. We need it peer-reviewed. We need it fought over and debated by academic minds like yourselves. We need it tested. We need repeatable findings of the highest integrity. We need the science to inform policy. We need to drive public consensus on what needs to be done. We need to inform investments. Last night, you heard a little bit, I think, from Maria Honeycutt and the other panel members. There's opportunities through revisions in how FEMA grants are handled or pre-disaster mitigation. Where is the science to inform how we're going to make those investments? Can we take the $6 of ROI we get back for $1 of investment, maybe turn it into 20? Be citizens-based. We have too many isolated point solutions. We need to think systematically about the interdependencies between individuals, between critical infrastructure. We need individuals to make better decisions, not just communities, not just governments. Where is the science? Where are the procedures, processes to help individuals be better informed, make better decisions? This is a huge issue. We're all very different. People learn differently. They understand, they're motivated by different things. Behavioral research, communications research, social sciences are actually critical. David Alexander talked a little bit last night about insurance. How do we get people to think differently about insurance and insurance decisions? You know, those insurance dollars they get, they become part of the financial lifeblood for restoring and recovery. And finally, just a comment. So I have a good friend I've worked with for decades in the emergency management space, and you know, I tend to want to hand out with the engineers and the IT people, and he keeps telling me that the most important people in emergency management are the social scientists, because it's all about how people are going to behave during an event. You have to understand that in advance. So again, let me just wrap up with the urgency that we need your science. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to this important meeting and for the opportunity to share some experiences. 3 words are proposed for this panel: impacts, risks, and vulnerabilities. Even though we went through a Category 5 hurricane in Puerto Rico, as you know, Maria, after Hurricane Irma, the current discussions of many experts in Puerto Rico are related not to a possible hurricane, but to the possibility of having an earthquake in Puerto Rico. We have had hurricanes in the past, but the last earthquake was in 1918. And experts say that a major earthquake is due in Puerto Rico. So really, the discussion in Puerto Rico right now is about a major disaster instead of an extreme weather event. But what have we learned from Maria? I will share with you some lessons that we have learned. First, nature will always be able to go beyond our capabilities. We can partially anticipate, but nature will always be able to go beyond our capabilities. And this requires long-term planning, particularly if we consider the possibility of an earthquake. Second, before a new event occurs, we have to anticipate, if possible, to protect us. And anticipation requires research, planning, organizing, establishing priorities, and communicating. Third, in the case of Puerto Rico has a very fragile infrastructure, and I would like to emphasize very fragile. The assessment of its key infrastructure systems is extremely important. Where are the hospitals located? What are the strategies to access those hospitals? How can we distribute food in the event of a disaster that affects our international airport or the San Juan port? Considering that 90% of our food is imported, 90%, and it goes through a very small channel. How to distribute medicines or water to the population? There are major issues in Puerto Rico right now with bridges along the routes from the San Juan port and airports to the cities. Fourth, there are current practices that have to be modified urgently. Irma and Maria showed us that many edifications in Puerto Rico were constructed with inadequate construction best practices. Families living in houses that are unsafe if a new event occurs should be relocated. There are political issues about that, but they should be relocated. The idea that if it resisted Maria, it will resist a new event is totally reckless. Many lives will be lost if this is not done urgently. Fifth, two terms are important: resist and be resilient. That is, being able to resist the impact of an event, but not consider right now in these comments a hurricane. Consider an earthquake and be able to recuperate in a short period of time. What would be the 5 most important lessons from Maria, in my opinion? First, the suffering caused by an extreme event is highly correlated to the level of infrastructure and utilities dependence. Communities with local supplies of water or electricity were able to recover faster. In our main campus, in our university, we were able to start the recovery efforts because we have an autonomous water supply. Second, learn from nature. Learn from nature. Anticipate and design your loss. There is no doubt that there will be losses, but design your loss. Losses will always occur. Anticipation is extremely important. Design your anticipated loss. And for instance, a person's home must be a secure haven. Third, some areas have to be declared unsafe places to build, and flood maps have to be respected. I have some additional comments, but I will share them later. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm glad the room is warm, coming from, and when I say warm, I mean your hospitality. I want to thank the organizers. Cecilio, let's hear it for Cecilio, and Rise. So I happen to be here today. I left government and partisan politics in late 2017 after my administration was defeated. And in early 2018, I was contacted and contracted to do a book on a family that from Dominica who had been displaced by Maria. That's how connected we all are. The matriarch was 75 years old. She had a 30-something-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old autistic grandson by the name of Noah. And when I walked in to meet the family, it was raining, and I realized that Noah's behavior was affected by the weather. I became very passionate about the plight of environmental refugees and also the impact of these horrible storms on children, and particularly children with disabilities. At the same time that I was contracted, my mother's cancer came back, and that slowed down my research, but it also gave me time to look into some of the literature available on both subjects. So we went through 12 rounds of chemo, radiation, hospitalization, and Mom passed away on the 28th of August, and on the 1st of September, Dorian came knocking and reminded me of the urgency of our work, because life goes on. So Dorian is the most intense cyclone to hit the Bahamas, regarded as the most harrowing natural disaster in our country's history. It tied with the 1935 Labor Day hurricane for the highest wind speeds. It struck Abaco first and then my island of Grand Bahama, and it sat over my island for over 30 hours. It just came to a complete stop. 70,000 people have been displaced. On Abaco, most of the structures were destroyed. On Grand Bahama, we lost lives. We're still calculating in the hundreds. It's estimated that the final count will be around 1,200. To date, I would say in Grand Bahama, about 90% of the electricity has been restored, but in Abaco, the number is under 20%. And children have just gone back to school. We lost our main hospital. We're grateful to partners in the United States, because we all are connected, that they came in and they're providing most of our medical services up to today. What I'm excited about in Rise is an answer to my own personal wondering on the role of tertiary education in bringing stability where disasters have occurred. And I say this from my experience in government and the civil service. And I say this also, my background being in law. I've researched a little bit the case between San Diego and Oakland against 5 of the big oil companies. And the good news about that is that climate change has been accepted as real by those courts. But the disturbing thing about that is the judge dismissed the case basically, to sum it up, on the grounds that relief should come from international diplomacy. And again, if we trace international diplomacy, a lot of the times it's not binding because administrations change. And with administrative changes, you can have one leader saying that it's real and the threat is urgent. You can have another leader saying that it isn't real, and therefore the threat is not urgent. So I believe that there is something special and peculiar about the stability that tertiary education, institutions of tertiary learning has brought to societies. It doesn't change. It isn't impacted in the main by governance and if administrations change and policies. It's a reservoir for tested education. And so in preparing for today, I looked at the 1899 hurricane that seriously impacted Puerto Rico and then moved into the Bahamas. And then I did a little analysis of what's common between disasters in that time and disasters of our time. And I found 4 primary areas. But what is optimistic is more than 100 years after 1899, we're still here, we're thriving, we find a way to be resilient. And so while my partner here would say that nature always finds a way to get ahead of us, I say that we always find a way to be resilient. And we must hold on to that and pass that on to generations behind us. So the 4 areas of interest was that developing economies were destroyed and redirected and reimagined. And then because of that, unemployment in 1899, like it is today, where I can say that 70% of businesses on my island remain closed due to the storm. Unemployment tends to spiral, and therefore we can imagine what that does to poverty. And thirdly, these death tolls and injuries tend to threaten the ethos of a society and the outlook on our futures. And finally, even though in 1899 the Bahamas was a colony, it's still a British colony, and so we would not describe the foreign interest in 1899 as foreign direct investment. The British nationals and government officials were indeed engaged in international investment. And we find that in today's reality, when storms hit, we are faced with challenges to foreign direct investment because of the heavy dependence on hotel development in small island developing states. So those 4 challenges remain. We had a heavy tourism campaign just after being hit, which basically said, we've got many islands, only 2 have been hit. Please come and visit because the others are still open for business. But I say we must ponder this dependence on foreign direct investment. We must become imaginative in tourism. 900 million people travel a year. My economy in the main is dependent on 6 million visitors. We can begin to imagine, supported by universities, your faculty and students, initiatives like RISE, that we can attract visitors based on volunteerism after storms, or eco and disaster models for tourism, so that right after storms, we're supplemented by persons who want to come to help and to experience what it is to be in a disaster zone. And so I end my initial remarks by also saying the potential of RISE, expanding beyond US and US territory is an imperative because it gives us access to existing knowledge and strategies that do not have to be reinvented, and we can become partners in this very stable environment of tertiary institutions. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Pete Lopez. I'm the Regional Administrator for US EPA, and my father is de Camuy, Puerto Rico. Yo soy Boricua también. I'm also a product of upstate rural New York, Appalachia, living and working in rural communities where I served 15 years as a local official, 21 years as staff to the state legislature, and a member of the state legislature in New York for 6 terms, where my career focus was on empowerment, was on home rule, strengthening capacity development, the ability of local communities to self-direct. And in that process, more recently and profoundly, and I have to say that this engagement, we welcome the universities, we welcome our colleagues from across the nation. Also, I'm an alum here. I'll throw that out here, class of 83 and 88. That we welcome the engagement of thoughtful people about the issues of how do we address impacts of nature, and how do we address the impacts as it ripples across our economies, our homes, our families, our community structures. And in my engagement, up front and very personal for me was Irene and Lee, which affected the Catskill region in New York State, where we had 18 inches of water in 24 hours, running down steep mountainsides into very narrow valleys. And not just inundation, but ripping, tearing impacts of water, similar to what we saw in the mountains in Puerto Rico. And the impact of that hitting structures, and some of my colleagues had very thoughtful comments, we could see how fragile the man-made structures were. And back to nature, we could see how quickly nature would recover. And I would say the same thing for Sandy. As much as we pride ourselves on our technology and our ability, our prowess, how fragile we really are as a community and as a society. And so part of the conversation is, again, not a function of if, it's a function of when. And so back to the paradigm, it's a function of how are we as a community coming together and looking back at our culture, our society, our practices, our programs, our statutes, our resources, and how are we repositioning ourselves to anticipate the next storm event, to protect homes and families and businesses, ensure that people can live. No one should have to live in fear. I think that would be the most important aspect. And I can recall my first engagement professionally, working in a community in the Susquehanna River Valley who had just been hit by major floods, and they were devastated. And we were working to help them recover. And that's when Irene hit my home community, 6 of my counties in states of emergency. We had 8 feet of water in my parents' home, in my small rural community. My parents were homeless, my community homeless. Entire governmental structures wiped out. And that same community had been missed by Irene and then Lee 10 days later took them out. And so the whole premise was, how do we rebuild? First question is, for the community, is do we rebuild? Do we stay? Do we have the will? Do we have the desire? Do we have the energy, the perseverance to go on? And I think the encouragement for us as a people is that we have to. We have to find ways to reposition, ways to readjust, ways to rethink our engagement. And I can remember sitting in a very small rural firehouse in Prattsville, New York, population 300, I think, talking with FEMA representatives about Katrina. And their observation was, we have to do something different, because if we don't, we are dooming our friends, our family, our neighbors to repeating the same cycle over and over and over again. So we heard reference to floodplains and floodplain maps. We heard reference to science and what science is telling us. The other piece is, what are we doing with it? And we heard reference to planning. And so the question is, all of that is critical, but it only matters to the extent that we can infuse that into the way we live and conduct ourselves. So all those resources, the planning, the science, has to make a difference on the ground. It has to result in changes. So I'll use an example back to that one community in Susquehanna River Valley, where they had an employer of 1,000 people, had been hit once. They said, if we're hit again, we're not coming back. Irene missed them, Lee hit them. They said, we're not coming back. So at the time I was in the State Assembly, I worked with the governor's office, and Governor Cuomo's office was extremely attuned and very capable in helping respond. The solution was to keep the company in place, but to bisect the company and to move half of it to higher ground, to bring infrastructure, critical infrastructure, to support the business on higher ground, and leave the portion that was okay where it was in the floodplain, leave it there. The business stayed, 1,000 jobs, regional employer. Imagine the impact in small rural communities when you lose 1,000 jobs. In my home community, same conversation. But part of the challenge, and this gets back, I heard reference to sociology, part of the challenge is as we as a community try to lead, you're only effective if you're not too ahead of the people that you're trying to serve. Because if they don't have ownership of your solutions, of your ideas, of your concepts, it won't work. So in that same community in Prattsville, I attempted to as they had done in Sydney, New York, which was the other location, they moved some of their home structures to higher ground. We talked about repositioning. So the people in Prattsville said, Assemblyman, I was Assemblyman at the time, what are you doing? You're abandoning Main Street. You're depopulating our center of our community. What are you doing? Well, the intent was to make them more resilient, but they didn't have ownership of that at that time. In my home community, we attempted to, in the floodplain, build resilient housing. So a structure was elevated 6 feet. The response from the neighbors was, what are you doing? You're building a fortress. Assemblyman, what are you doing? You're building a fortress. Well, no, we're addressing a new normal. And so now if you look at that fortress, it's really not a fortress. It's beautiful, and the slope is graded, and there's planting, but it's resilient. And it's a change. But part of the challenge that we have is, and I've seen this play out now, so I'm now currently in my role in EPA, and I want to thank my colleagues, Carmen Guerrero. Where's Carmen? Donde? Carmen. Please stand. Arriba, por favor. So Carmen is, please, yes, she deserves the applause. Carmen is the director of our Caribbean division, and I also want to say, as we focus on Puerto Rico, don't forget our friends in the Virgin Islands as well. They need our help desperately. Please. I also have Joe from our regional council. Joe, please stand. And is Joel here? Joel's with our climate adaptation. Is Joel here as well? Joel, please stand. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to say to you, we are in such a hurry as a society to restore our way of living that we often overlook the fundamental changes that we need to engage in to protect us from the next event. So we rebuild houses. We put them back on the same level where we were, or we build them in the same place, regardless of the risk in front of us. We rebuild businesses, again, regardless of the risk. We look at structures, water, sewer, electrical infrastructure, and we rush to put it back in kind. And some of that is part of the structure that exists nationally. So we have the Stafford Act, which is, again, my friend from Homeland Security can vouch for, says put it back in kind. It doesn't really contemplate resiliency. It doesn't really contemplate the next event. So as we rush as a society to put it back in place, we spend millions and billions of dollars. Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands is looking at some $40 billion of reinvestment. One of the largest single, as we've heard, most profound storm events, and nationally acknowledged as such. But as we work in that direction, the question is, do we have the patience? Do we have the engagement? Do we have the entrepreneurial spirit? Do we have the ability and willingness to talk to each other? And the patience to try something different that will leave our community stronger, more resilient, and hopefully less fearful as we move forward. Puerto Rico was especially profound to the extent that we went without power for 8 months to over a year in some of the rural communities. Imagine being in a storm event and not having the ability to power your homes and businesses, to transport goods properly. So the whole issue is, what are we doing as a society? And I have to say that has to be an engagement not just of the government, but also of our institutions, our educational institutions, our not-for-profits, our community leaders. And we have to think, how are we transforming and what are we doing different? And also, and I would say this, there's also opportunity. So where there is deprivation, where there is destruction, there's also an opportunity to build back stronger and more resilient, to do things more cost effectively, to do things more intelligently, even to attack, my friends from FEMA may not like this, to attack pre-existing condition even while in recovery. And I'll use a quick example and I'll stop there. So in the mountains of Puerto Rico, we have the Namprasa water systems. And from an EPA standpoint, selfishly, many of them don't comply with federal drinking water standards. We want our people to have clean water to drink. So in that engagement, we have developed an MOU, and let me look for my list of some of the names, with the Puerto Rico Community Foundation, with Water Mission International, American Red Cross, Puerto Rico Science Research Technology Trust, Por los Nuestros, Oxfam, Polytechnic University of Puerto Rico, USDA, and others to rethink how we're structuring these systems. So we're building systems that didn't even exist. They had no legal documentation. They weren't even incorporated. So we're helping them become structures. We are, in some cases, putting solar panels with battery backup systems to allow them to be self-sufficient. And the foundation in particular, I think we heard our colleagues speak about some of that. And importantly, the other piece is, what are we doing to support them as they continue to function? So if you can imagine, we have put circuit riders, USDA technical support people, to assist them with rebuilding and maintaining their systems over time. So I just want to punctuate the profound nature of this engagement and the importance of your energy, your passion, your ideas, your creativity, because we need to be collaborative. And the collaboration has to come from the grassroots. I heard that loud and clear. So my email was Grassroots Pete. That was you'll find me on the email. But it has to come up with the local sense of priority, but also the resources that support home rule and local decision making. So with that, thank you. I'll turn it back. Thank you.
So we're envisioning a new paradigm. We're actually doing this together in this moment. We've set the intention to say, based on what we know and what we've learned going all the way back to 1899, all of the investments that we've made out of the federal enterprise, state and local government, the community level investments by different leaders and sectors, and we get down to the human factor. And I think we've heard now over the course of the last day, we've heard this morning already, a big part of what determines the resilience of a community is its people. And the beauty of some of the response is that doors open and people all become one family in these places. And I wonder, through the power of story, because a lot of what we've also heard this morning and yesterday becomes so much more real because we're hearing it from people who have experienced it firsthand. You're leading this work, and you're also on the ground, impacted directly by these events. So in a very concrete way, and this is the hard part of my question, and I'm hesitating a bit, but I think I'm going to take this risk. If we were to be most critical, what would you do differently? What will you do differently? What should we all do as we continue to design Rise? And as I reflect, I can tell you last night when Cecilio stood up on stage just before our evening plenary, what we have already learned is that we have people here in this room, Faith, the community that you come from in the Bahamas, who in real time are experiencing, enduring, and living in the aftermath of extreme weather events. And we're here, and we have some of those people with us, so we need to make them visible. Part of our new paradigm should consider how can we engage and approach those of you who are vulnerable and currently dealing with these impacts to rally our assets. Can we take some of the students and host them further on our university campuses? Can we build constellations of local government leaders and within the university enterprise, deans and directors and faculty members of science, not to go and point and say, this is how this should be done, rather to go and say, what can we do to help you? So my question again, if you were most critical among friends, what would you do differently, and what will you do differently going forward?
I would say continuity. I think we're here for 3 days, and then everybody moves on and goes back to whatever we do, and we just forget because other things are taking over. So I would say continuity. I think we need to force ourselves to, if it is like a quarterly meeting, whatever it is, checking that it's in your calendar and you don't cancel. I think if I would sum it up, I would really say continuity. We have beautiful discussions, but then nothing comes out of it because after that discussion, we go back home and do whatever we do on a day-to-day.
For my part, I think driving the conversation increasingly towards resilience and preparedness. Disasters are disasters because we make choices to live places that are unsafe and not understand the risk, and invest in things and not insure and be happy the sun's out. We need to think more and harder and act around resiliency and preparedness. There's a term out there some of you have heard, it's called the research gold rush. So after a disaster, a lot of money becomes available to do research. We need to stop that. The heroes need to be the folks in this room who are doing pre-disaster mitigation research to inform policy in those decisions. We need to have empathy for the people who are living, in places that are highly dangerous through no fault of their own. A great deal of hardship is going to be required to, harden our society. Sea level rise, ideas like retreat from the coast, they are hard. We need the science to inform decisions at policy, but also understand how to communicate with empathy to individuals, help them make the right decisions. We need to do something different, and it's not disaster recovery. I'd rather not be doing that.
I will mention 3 points. I think that new students from K to 16 have to be educated about the things that we are discussing here today. And having heard about 400 persons from 150 universities, I think that we have really the opportunity of developing a platform to educate our new generations about the issues that we are discussing here. Second, I was asking myself, how many theses and dissertations are prepared in our universities? I would say thousands. Can they be placed to focus on extreme weather events and disasters? But more importantly, do we have the will to do that? To create the platforms in our universities to focus some of those theses and dissertations on these issues. And third, how can we link the extraordinary resources that are available in this meeting? Research centers, faculty, researchers, people of goodwill. Can we create, again, a platform to bring together these resources to focus on this extremely important area of extreme weather events or disasters? And finally, I think that resilience is a function of education, but also how do we eliminate the structural blocks that are in our communities in order to be resilient. Sometimes things are centralized, so it is extremely difficult for the communities to be resilient because there are structural blocks. But I think that RISE can be really a powerful platform to do this.
Well said. As I sit here, I think we have to do what storms do and what the function of knowledge is, and that is to remove the borders. And so when we sit like this, we must see each other first and foremost as brothers and sisters in humanity, and realize that threat from climate change isn't just a hurricane. It's extreme weather patterns all across the world. It's fires for the wealthy and not so wealthy in California. It's the the sub-Saharan woman in search of water and food for her children. And so the commonality is that this thing makes us borderless, and so our hearts should be borderless. And with that, there's something about resiliency that requires imagination. And so we can inspire the scientists in particular. And it's strange for me to say this because I'm so deeply spiritual, but spirituality for me right now seems to be the imagination of scientists, because they are the ones who will have to dream how we become even more resilient. How we, for example, take the energy of these storms, which one meteorologist from my country says, if we ever find the capability to do that, we can power the United States for 6 months. So will our scientists ever dream ways to transfer the energy from these storms, making them opportunities rather than just hazards, and how we apply that to moving forward as the human species? And I think that leads us to what is even more common to our common state of humanity, and as we must always hold on to hope. We must always be optimistic, even when our dead lay beside us and we must bury them, and our jobs are lost, and our economies are challenged. We must remember that we have risen before, and we will rise again.
So to reflect on what would we do differently, what are we doing differently, and I would take us back to some of the early observations is that, and back to the comment about resiliency, stemming from within, and that's true. But resiliency also needs support. And resiliency also needs to understand the community that it's engaged with. And resiliency also needs to understand the limitations and financial constraints that may affect the ability of a people to recover. And I would say that part of the conversation we're having at the federal level, within the federal family, is as we look at recovery, response is the first piece, the emergent need to human health and urgent safety, public safety concerns. Then we leave that structured, almost very structured, almost paramilitary type of engagement into recovery, which I found through my engagement now with EPA is a more entrepreneurial, less structured engagement. That we need to position ourselves to know who are we serving, and what length of time do we need to be there? What resources and assets have to be infused, again, to the local level to promote change? And so from that standpoint, that requires times of reflection. That requires introspection. It requires hard decision making. And a thoughtful conversation at the community level, back to the issues of where are our risks, where are our assets in danger, our homes, our families, our businesses, our infrastructure, and how are we driving resources collaboratively to affect that change. And I would say to the host assembled here, my biggest exhortation is plug in. Understand the process, understand the structure, understand and identify the decision makers, and plug in. I was at a reception at the president's home, and I was heartened to hear the president of Hudson Valley Community College, a small community college not far from here, saying that they're in Vieques working. And I thought, how wonderful. We didn't even know you were there. We're in Vieques, EPA working with Department of Energy on microgrid energy, a standalone energy system in Vieques. We'd like to know what you're doing in Hudson Valley. We'd like to know what the institutional communities are doing here. So as an invitation and an exhortation at the same time, plug in, talk to us, communicate, see how we can support each other. And I think back to the role of our institutions. Peer research is one thing, volunteerism is one thing, technology transfer, technical assistance with planning, consensus building, leveraging other investment. The power of our educational institutions are only limited by the time and the energy that we have to put into it. And what I like best, and I've learned this again through my master's here, there's a term I use, boundary spanners, where someone is not locked in a silo. Too many people are locked in a silo. I often say to EPA, you're too EPA-centric. Stop it. Because I come from a world where there's no one program, no one resource, no one agency that's going to drive an entire solution to even a simple project. But it requires collaboration and the creative energies and ideas and resources of a community. So I would say to do something different and rise as a focal point for that, plug in, talk to us, find the decision makers, find ways to join us with our sector-based planning in recovery in the Caribbean. Help understand where maybe you can assist with housing, maybe you can assist with infrastructure strengthening and hardening for future storm events. So that would be my biggest encouragement. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now going to go to questions. Cecilia. And if you have a question, please go to the mic in the middle of the room.
This one works. Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
This has been an outstanding conversation, and thank you, Jorge, Iván, for traveling all the way over here. Thank you, Faith, for your relationship. Tony, everything I hear from you is positive, and we really need to have a deeper conversation that goes beyond this panel with the Homeland Security community. And I say that as a scientist and as a Puerto Rican. But yes, yes. We're glad you're here. Glad you're here. Now, RISE is attempting to re-envision relationships so that eventually I don't need EPA to tell me to plug in, because our relationship would be one where this flow would be baked in. Okay? So, because I'm a musician, I use amplifiers, and plugs are crappy. You know, they come out, sound scratches when there's some sort of, interference. So we're trying to use metaphors to better the way we visualize that relationship. And I want to utilize one example that's live in flesh, human, here with us, to exemplify that. And RISE, even though it's a thought, it's a concept, it's already doing things that touch the lives of those 240 community aqueduct systems, or non-PRASA systems, or as EPA perceives them, 2040 issues that we have outstanding out there. Well, I would like for RISE students to stand up. They're in the room.
Yes.
Stand up and be recognized as students that have made a commitment. After Maria, they've been adopted by universities to go pursue graduate studies in areas where the needs of Puerto Rico and their future align. Mutual benefit. And they've made a commitment that their work, their dissertation, is focused on an issue, a pressing issue for Puerto Rico. One of those issues is non-PRASA systems. Why? Because they're hubs of resilience. They already are. PRASA comes to them when they're in trouble with their centralized system. And there is a mutual perception of issues and conflict that needs to be studied, just like we study the bacteriology of the resource. Victor Ruiz started working in INESI, studying these systems and studying them from an organizational standpoint and the impact that organizational capacity has on the operation of these and the sustainability of these systems. He is now pursuing a PhD in environmental social science. My question to you is, what can EPA do, not only to Victor, but to sit down with each one of these RISE students and offer support, whether it doesn't have to be money, access to data, a conversation that actually enhances their ability to finish their research, and it enhances your capacity to answer some of the very questions you're asking here right now.
So, Senor, since EPA was mentioned a couple times, I would say, Senor, ven acá, por favor. So I would say to you that my observation is, and this is what we're attempting to do, my engagement with EPA is only for 2 years. And what I found with any agency is that, and it's just human nature, there tends to be a depersonalization. Agencies tend to look at people, issues, problems more as objects rather than subjects, people of flesh and blood. individuals with hopes, dreams, needs. And what I'm attempting to do and what we're doing in the Caribbean and with Carmen and her team, and through this MOU, this Memorandum of Understanding with the non-profit and the NGOs and these other, is to reach into those communities and engage them in ways that have never been engaged. So Jose Font, who's our deputy director, has said, Pete, we've been here before, we need compliance, they need to have safe drinking water, you're not going to fix this. And I'll say, Jose, watch me. And so it's not just EPA, it's a community. And the community has a task force and is meeting. Carmen, how often? Where's Carmen? There she is. Yes, I'll go quickly. So what I would say is we would welcome having your students, your energy, your knowledge, and con Carmen in Guaynabo, have you come and be part of our engagement, not just with EPA, but with the broader community. So that'd be my answer. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I would like to now go to the second mic towards the latter half of the room and ask for the question from the back of the room.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I've heard most of the panelists talk about doing things differently in a way that makes our jurisdictions more resilient, and talk about infrastructure, talk about energy. And what I'd like to ask is, how do we do that in the face of current efforts to really make the whole Caribbean substitute current energy generation for gas-fired power plants, primarily coming from the U.S.? And this applies, as I said, to most of the Caribbean. We're seeing this push to bring the gas from the States to the different islands. And although there's a current situation with the Jones Merchant Marine Act that makes it a little more complicated, there's a huge effort to build out all kinds of 3 marine gas ports, 1 land-based gas port, a whole slew of combined cycle plants to burn that gas. And this will not make the energy systems more resilient on these islands. And so it's imminent. We've already seen permits been issued by EPA, by other agencies for this kind of infrastructure. There are all kinds of various efforts, civil society efforts. In Puerto Rico, we have the Queremos Sol proposal, We Want Sun. This is the translation. It's online, it's in English, it's in Spanish. Published it last year. The Energy Public Policy Law adopted the goal of 100% renewables by 2050, but... Please
ask us your questions so
right.
we can, yeah.
Okay, so how can we be proactive? How can the agencies and the representatives here and everyone working on these issues help to avoid creating more vulnerability by depending on imported and central station fossil generation, as opposed to what is better adapted to the Caribbean, like, for example, solar communities, using, as the studies show, the rooftop resource?
Thank you.
That's my question. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Jorge, do you want to ask your question quickly? And we'll take 2 questions at a time now. I'm sorry, we're almost out of time. So
I'm going to be far because my question would be very complicated, but I'm just going to plant the seed because I hope that it will be addressed. Love your words. Actions that I see do not back them up. And I would like to know where the draft of the new Environmental Protection Agency on strengthening transparency in regulatory science, which is going to compel every researcher that has done their research with integrity, with peer review and everything, to disclose even the most confidential information regarding water, health, energy, and I'm just confused. So I would like to reconcile sometime in the dialogue, when do words and actions actually match?
Thank you. So I'm going to ask our panelists to spend just 1 minute answering a very complicated set of questions. We are going to go about 5 minutes late. For those of you that are leading the next sessions, bear with us. We're going to go about 5 minutes late.
They're looking at me, so I guess I'll jump in. And I'm okay with that. So I guess I'd hit the first question. So in regard to the energy equation on the island, again, that is engaged by PREPA, the authority which is part of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. It's a home rule decision making. We do know that, at least in speaking to the president, the director of PREPA, that they do have a long-term goal to go to renewables. And at present, they're talking about a 60-40 split, 60% natural gas, 40% renewables. But Carmen, I believe going to 100% renewables by 2050. And so the challenge is right now getting them off of oil and poor quality oil that was used during the emergency. So short answer is there is a discussion, there's a dialogue, it resides with PREPA. There is assistance and guidance being provided by state and federal agencies, New York Power Authority, Department of Energy, and I would dare say that PREPA is open to more conversation. Thank you. Just quickly on the transparency piece, I'd like to talk to you because, again, I'm not from headquarters, but I would be happy to get back to you and help you understand that conversation on the science and transparency. And I'm at 0 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other? So we are at time. Before we formally wrap, for those of you standing at the microphones, we're going to ask that you ask your questions. We do want to hear them. We won't have time to answer them. It's not to leave everyone with a cliffhanger. But it is important for those of you that have questions to know that we want to hear them and that you're heard.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Cecilio and Marla and all the organizers for this wonderful conference. My name is Megan Cairns. I work with the Rocky Mountain Institute in Boulder, Colorado. I was sitting at a table with members of FEMA last Thursday in San Juan, and we were discussing the vision for the energy future of Puerto Rico. There's millions of dollars waiting to be spent on the energy infrastructure, but they are looking to PREPA to have a vision. The vision has not yet been created. It's called the Integrated Resource Plan. It's been in revisions and rejections for over a year. And is there a world in which, instead of looking to PREPA, for example, whose vision candidly is to be privatized and everyone can retire and have pensions, is there a future in which actually the vision could come from all of us in the room, from academia, from those who really have a desire to create a resilient energy future instead of the powers that be? And I know that's a long shot, but that's my question.
Thank you. Question at the back of the room.
Good morning. I'm wondering if RISE is giving serious consideration to strengthening the bridge between universities and communities through the inclusion on the platform of teachers, K-12.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Following up on your expressions on continuity, borderless interaction, on a new scientific imagination, and on the driving resources for the promotion of change, I believe that the imaginative ideation and validation process of this new paradigm is being effectively executed. The fact that we are here is the proof. It is my understanding that we are at the crossroads of a design challenge, designing the development and the implementation of the paradigm. I have a series of questions on implementation, not expecting answers, but placing them more as an assignments. The first question is, are we as universities and stakeholders, faculty, students, trustees, accreditation agencies, and governments, ready for the new operational organizational model of that paradigm? If the answer is yes, how is the new paradigm looks like? What is the form of this new organization? Is it a public or a private organization? What does it take, or what do we need to implement it? Do we need legislation? How long will it take us to implement the new paradigm? I'm done.
Great. Thank you so much. I am now going to bring our panel to a close. The good thing is we have the rest of the day to spend with our panelists. Thank you all.